cover a lot of material tonight, but hopefully I can simplify it down to just a few points at least that we can take away tonight, because we could probably spend hours talking about thyroid. I know we could, probably for days. So I'll try to condense this. That's why I'll go through the handout towards the end of the slides, towards the end of the presentation. We'll walk through that a little bit too. I might have an hour worth of material, and then what I'd like to do is, for those of you that brought your labs, we'll kind of walk through one of the last pages in there, because it's a really helpful tool to just kind of put what we're going to talk about into your own personal context. So hopefully that'll be a helpful process that we'll go through. So if you haven't heard me present before, I get passionate about what I'm talking about. So I'm not telling you to stop your thyroid medication tonight, even though you might glean that from the content. So that's what that says. I just got an email a few hours ago saying, oh, I live in Green Bay. I can't come to your talk. I really wish you could live stream this. Yeah.
That's where it came from.
We'll have to start orchestrating carpools for the whole state. But so we do record the seminars. You can go to YouTube. This is our YouTube channel, and all of our talks are on there. Replay them as many times as you'd like. So again, why are we here? So it's the old question of, my labs are fine, my doctor says my TSH is in the normal range, here's an SSRI, you must be depressed, or here's some phentermine to help you lose weight, or there's probably a million drugs that we all heard of that prescribers, they don't know what to do. You fall within the normal range, and your TSH is where it should be, but yet you have all of these symptoms going on. My goal tonight, though, it's not about thyroid medication. It's about not sticking another. I think of thyroid medication, unfortunately, in most cases, as another Band-Aid. And hopefully, you'll agree with me by the end of tonight that really thyroid medication in most cases is just another substitute. And we're not getting to the root cause of the problem. So, as all Band-Aids are, if we tear them off, it does hurt just for a little bit, but at the end we'll heal, right? Yeah. If you're going to check out soon, just remember what's on this slide right here. Your T3 activates, so T3 activates, TSH fabricates. So T3 activates, so I'll get into that in a couple more slides down the road here. So again, T3 activates, TSH fabricates. It's deceitful intent. So there's good intention behind the TSH. It doesn't tell us the whole story that we need to help us figure out what's going on with the thyroid gland. So that's important to take home. All right, so if you're still with me, let's keep going here. Thyroid medication, again, should be your last resort in fixing your labs. So that seems a little bit counterintuitive. Why? You go to your endocrinologist, your TSH, let's say it is out of range. It's low, it's high, whatever the case may be. Typically, your TSH is elevated, which means you're not producing enough thyroid hormone. So they're going to put you on some Synthroid or some Cytomel or some hormone thyroid. But that's really not the problem, again, in most cases. So let's find out what those other situations that could be happening. You could have a broken immune system. So we'll talk about HASHIMOTO'S tonight. A third of the patients with low thyroid function have an autoimmune disease called HASHIMOTO'S. So it has really, again, the end result is your thyroid gland isn't working properly, but it's really because of your immune system. So let's fix the immune system to then fix the thyroid problem. So we'll talk more about that. You simply might have a blood sugar problem. You might have too high of blood sugar, which stresses out your adrenal glands, which then shuts down your thyroid gland. So it could be something as just, this is a very simple case, but if we can control blood sugar, that means that we can better control cortisol, which then will not negatively impact our thyroid gland. So we could do something just as simple as diet modification and resolve some thyroid issues. I'm not going to get a lot into gut infections, but There's things like candida or just bacterial overgrowth, dysbiosis in general, that we can start to uncover, which can lead to that autoimmune dysfunction, into HASHIMOTO'S. So that needs to be looked at. The adrenal dysfunction, we'll get more into that a little bit later on, but if we have a high amount of stress in our body, which means that we then have a high amount of cortisol, that's going to negatively impact our thyroid gland from functioning properly. So you could have, again, a high TSH, doctor says you have hypothyroidism, and really, in fact, you just have a huge amount of cortisol that's shutting down your thyroid production. So do we ever look at cortisol? Even simpler yet, is you could have low progesterone. Progesterone, we know, positively impacts the enzyme that takes T4, and I'll get to this in a minute too, but it takes T4 into T3, and progesterone helps to modify that enzyme to work more effectively, and so you could have low progesterone, and that could be causing your hypothyroidism. But I'm assuming with all the questions I get in the consult booth here at the pharmacy that a lot of practitioners, unfortunately, aren't even looking at these 5 bullet points, and they really should be. It really gets to the bottom, the core of what's going on. One other point, I get this call a lot, probably. When we used to compound porcine thyroid, which was about a year ago because we couldn't get the raw material. But I would get phone calls about porcine thyroid, oh my gosh, 10 times a day. And is it natural? And I want natural thyroid, and so on and so forth. But just so we're all clear, porcine thyroid, so pig thyroid, it's bioidentical to a pig, right? So everyone's, I want natural thyroid, I want the porcine. So granted, porcine or pig thyroid is T3 and T4, but it's not in the same ratio that the human thyroid gland makes. So a pig produces, for every 1 molecule of T3, it produces 4 molecules of T4. Our body produces 1 molecule of T3 and 11 to 12 molecules of T4. So the ratios are different.
Is NP thyroid from pigs?
So NP thyroid is from pig, Armour thyroid, Nature Thyroid. There's a few other ones I'm missing out there, but those are the main ones. So granted, a lot of patients, even at this pharmacy, are on porcine thyroid, the NP thyroid, the Armour, and they do very well, or they do fairly well, better than Synthroid because it has T3 in there. But it still isn't perfect, and it still doesn't get to these issues here either, potentially. Again, it just is a Band-Aid. It's more natural than synthetic, but in my opinion, it's not a good fix or a permanent good fix. So let's get into low thyroid productions. There's a lot here. There's a comprehensive look at all possible causes for hypothyroidism. Autoimmune I touched on already, so our own immune system could be producing antibodies that are then attacking the tissue of the thyroid gland, and then T3 and T4 production goes down. So that could be one reason why you have low thyroid. Or another way to say it is you have low production, so that means on your labs you would have a high TSH. So those two numbers are inversely related. So if you have an elevated TSH number, that means that you have a low T4 number. So you could have, you could just have lack of production of hormone. We'll get into this in a minute in more detail. Poor conversion of 4 to 3. So again, the one take-home point, T3 activates. Just keep remembering that T3 is what does all the work, does all the heavy lifting. So you could have poor conversion from 4 to 3. So T4 is Synthroid, levothyroxine. So Synthroid is the brand name, levothyroxine is the generic name. That is a prodrug. What I mean by that is you can take all of the Synthroid in the world that you want to help your thyroid gland, but if you do not have the enzyme to convert it to T3 to T4, I'm sorry, say that wrong, T4 to T3, it's going to do you absolutely no good.
Say that again.
So yeah, so if you take Synthroid and you do not have the enzyme to convert, it will do nothing in your body to help with your thyroid function.
Where did you say
It's
T3?
You-
It's T4.
T4, yeah.
when you talk about enzyme?
Enzyme, that's throughout your whole entire body essentially, mainly in your liver. 60% of conversion from T4 into T3 occurs in your liver. We'll circle back on that too.
You'll talk about the enzyme
That controls that, yeah.
Which is impacted by low cholesterol.
That's right.
Got it.
Yeah, there's a lot of, we're gonna talk in detail about this enzyme because this little bugger doesn't like to work the way it should. It's critical. Decreased intracellular transport of T3. Hopefully you've never heard of that until just now. But if you have an issue, your labs might be perfect. All of your numbers are right where they need to be. And if you can't take T3 and stick it onto the nucleus of the cell to then have that action work, you've got nothing again. So this is, again, you can hopefully already see that there's a lot of issues where labs are great, but you feel like crap still, right? Labs are, in my mind, labs are just a guide to how the patients feel. Treat the patient, not the labs. I'm sure, hopefully you've heard me say that before. Less than optimal thyroid receptor function. So maybe that T3 does get into the cell, it gets transported to the nucleus of the cell, but the receptor's junk. Great, you got all the way to that final step and then nothing. So that could be the reason why you have all these symptoms of low thyroid. So we'll dig into all of these in more detail, but that's what we want to chase after. So again, this is low thyroid production, producing T3, producing T4. Hashimoto's, I talked about that already. Scope of the problem. So just to put some numbers around this, so 12% of the US population over a lifetime suffers with low thyroid function. This is a huge problem. 45 million people, give or take. Approximately 30 million patients are affected. A third of those have the autoimmune hypothyroidism. So we're going to spend a few slides, a little bit of time talking specifically on Hashimoto's tonight too, which really is it's an autoimmune disease, not an endocrine. The endocrine system is ultimately affected at the end, but to fix that problem, fix the immune system. So I'll definitely shed some light on that, because I can tell you, I have patient after patient that sits down in the booth, and I talk with them, and they tell me they have Hashimoto's, and they're here for their thyroid medication that we just compounded for them, and a month later, 2 months later, their dose changes, it goes up, it goes down, and they're on this roller coaster, excuse me, for years and years and years. And it's unfortunate, because what's going on there is some days your immune system says, well, I'm going to produce just a ton of more antibodies because you ate some gluten 3 days ago, and I'm going to kick up my antibody production, which is going to decrease your thyroid hormone output, and you're going to feel like crap. And then you might do that and not even notice that. Go do your labs. Your labs are worse than it was last time, so your doctor is going to raise your dose. And you're on that cycle. I've been seeing that for 15 years now. So hopefully we can get you off of that roller coaster tonight. Or at least get 1 foot off the roller coaster. We'll ease into that transition. TSH, this is important too. For those of you that have Hashimoto's, TSH can remain normal for up to 10 years from the start of antibody production. So you can start producing antibodies. Your immune system will start attacking itself very slowly, but it's still there, it's measurable. And your TSH won't change for 5, 10 years out. So you're having these symptoms, they're building, you're starting to feel, again, more and more symptoms of low thyroid. Your doctor keeps testing your TSH and keeps telling you you're fine, and then, at some point he's going to, whip out a drug probably in the script pad and want to prescribe something else, not non-endocrine related. And then we get down that slippery slope real fast. So this guy definitely, I don't know, I think he's got a thyroid problem. Yeah. All right. Let's see what I've got here. So measuring total T4. In general, when we look at just normal physiology, our bodies start producing less T4 around age 50. So we've got to keep that in mind, of course. It says, there's a caution here. If only free T4 is measured, we need to rule out excessive binding. What do I mean by that? So we'll get into the handout here towards the end, but I do see patients quite often, they'll have a TSH and the doctor will have a total T4 level. So they'll have 2 numbers for me instead of just 1. So we're getting there. And so the doctor, the TSH will be fine, the total T4 will be in the normal range. Again, you still get the diagnosis of you're fine, it's not your thyroid. There's a lot of reasons that bind up your T4. So if you're not measuring free T4, so let me explain what that even means. So we're producing T3 and T4 out of our thyroid gland and gets dumped into our bloodstream. Circulates throughout our whole entire body. There are certain proteins, thyroid proteins, that bind up that thyroid hormone. When it's bound, it's rendered useless. So it's got to be unbound to then get converted in the liver, and then after it gets converted in the liver, it still has to be unbound as T3, go to the nucleus of the cell, sit on the receptor, the magic happens and we feel better. So there's a lot of steps involved here. So what I'm getting at here, there's a lot of things, especially for women, that we got to look at here if any of these things are going on. So oral estrogen. Classic example, if you ever read the fine print on birth control, it says that it can cause hypothyroidism. This is why. Oral estrogen in the form of birth control will bind up more T4. And then that patient feels like me, and they start to feel sluggish. So anyone on birth control, we need to start looking at their free T4 and see what's going on there. Pregnancy. I won't get into all the details there. Thyroid medication. What's going on here with thyroid? I'm trying to take thyroid to help my thyroid problem, and it's making it worse. So if you overdose, just like any hormone I've talked about, more hormone is not good. You're going to get receptor downregulation, you're going to get excessive binding, you're going to increase the production of these binding proteins. So you don't want to flood the system is what that says. You got to be careful on that dose. I see it over and over again though. Patient goes to their doctor, I feel like crap, this dose isn't working, oh, let's give you more. You might feel good for a little while, get over a little hump, 2-3 months later, you feel like crap even more so. So be very careful about just taking more, taking more, taking more. It's kind of like the analogy of the diabetic with insulin. The more insulin you give the patient, the more their blood sugar is better, but then what happens is the more insulin the insulin's main role in the body is to store fuel. So then they gain weight. And then you gotta take more insulin, and you gain more weight, and it's a never-ending battle. Same thing is going on here. Chronic sleep deprivation. I don't know how distribution got in there, but deprivation. Distribute sleep. And, I always caution patients, new moms or soon-to-be moms, that you can see here, they're on birth control, and they're off birth control, and they get pregnant. And then you have a newborn at home, and you can't sleep at all. I honestly see this all the time. And then these new moms come in and they're like, yeah, did you know that was going to happen? It's already been predicted. Possible causes of low T4 production. Some of these things can be simple. So lack of raw material. So iodine and tyrosine make up what we need to make T3 and T4. So if you don't have enough raw material, you're not going to produce enough T4. So you got to make sure you got enough iodine in your body. Well, how do I know that? Do a test. It's a very easy test. We sell them here. Your doctor could easily do an iodine test. It's a urine test essentially. Find out what your level is. I don't know off the top of my head how to do tyrosine testing. I'm sure it's out there. Tyrosine is an amino acid. As long as you're eating a decent diet and getting in protein, you could do that. There actually is tyrosine amino acid supplements that are out there on the market. You can take that to try to improve your T4 production. So for me, the bigger problem is the iodine. Most patients are iodine deficient if there's a lack of T4 production. It's usually not a tyrosine issue unless their diet is very poor. I would start going after iodine first in my list of things to look at if I'm producing low T4. Key point on stress. So again, you could have let's say you have a low production of T4. It strictly could be just because you have too much cortisol in your system. So if you're ever going to go and do a thyroid test and you know you're stressed out, ask the doctor to order a cortisol test, or better yet, what we call it's called a 4-point cortisol test. And that's measure your cortisol throughout the whole entire day. Because if your cortisol is high, your T4 production is going to be low. It's a direct inhibitor, and that's something we typically don't look at. You can have pituitary hypofunction. I'm not going to get into that too much. Poor nutrition. Hypochlorohydria. This is just low stomach acid. So this is a small piece of the puzzle here, but for patients that don't like red meat because it just sits in their stomach, they stay away from heavy foods, a lot of protein because they just don't digest them well, that particular patient just might not produce enough stomach acid. There's a correlation there between low stomach acid and not enough T4, because you're really not breaking down all your proteins efficiently enough to get that tyrosine out of protein as part of it. You could have thyroid gland destruction. That's the HASHIMOTO'S. You can actually have antibodies just killing the tissue, breaking down the tissue that's supposed to be producing this T4 for us. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on toxicity, but there's chronic inflammation, Epstein-Barr virus. If you've kind of gone through a list with your doctor already on what's causing your low thyroid production, look at Epstein-Barr virus. There's a whole book written on Epstein-Barr, and I won't get into that completely tonight, but it's one of those things I tell patients at least to cross off your list. If you've been chasing low thyroid issues for a long time, look at chronic infection, especially Epstein-Barr. That's a big culprit out there. And then liver dysfunction. So circling back to T4 and to T3 activates. Well, if you don't have a healthy liver, you're going to be hard pressed to get enough T3 pumped into your blood to make your engine go. So we've got to make sure we've got a very healthy, strong liver. Gut food allergies, chronic infection. The biggest thing for me is gluten, and I'll circle back on that when we talk more about Hashimoto's, dairy and soy, and then there's a cross-reactivity there with eggs. So again, if you kind of looked at everything, and you haven't looked at food allergies, it's again one of those things to cross off your list to see if that's contributing to your low thyroid production.
And Epstein-Barr, it seems like most of the population has had Epstein-Barr, and so it shows it as being inactive. But that, I also heard that's because it's hiding within the body and within the glands. So if you know you've had it, what do you do to treat it? Yeah.
There are different antiviral, and there's a whole book written on it. Essentially, there's different protocols to improve your immune system overall to help to reduce the titers and the viral load, even though it's hiding in the tissues. I'm trying to think of the author that wrote the Epstein-Barr book. I can't think of it, but I'll post it on the YouTube notes. So again, that's hormone production. I touched on iodine already. If you don't know your iodine level, I would have that checked. Or the other thing too is if you're on, well, here's my little soapbox. We're getting off of different halides, so bromide. So that's an issue. Fluoride in toothpaste. I'm not a huge fan of fluoride. There's no evidence that fluoride helps with teeth. And then chloride. So stay away from all these other halides that are pushing out iodine. So unfortunately, iodine gets kicked out of the body when these other halides get dumped into our system, probably inadvertently. There's a lot of fluoride in SSRIs. If you look at the chemical structure for, I believe it's Prozac, there's four or five fluoride molecules on that antidepressant. So now you give a hypothyroid patient that you misdiagnosed as depressed, and you give them a medication that's got fluoride that then kicks out their iodine. And their thyroid production even goes down even more. Maybe I'll
Dan,
sit
how
there and
would
scratch.
you figure out that that was an issue? Just assume it if you're on an SSRI, or?
Look at the chemical structure, because not all antidepressants have those that the fluoride. But then, like, even look at the fine print on a package insert for an SSRI. In the really fine print, it'll get all the way down to the bottom and, like, you know, rare side effects. Talk to your super rare side effects. Hypothyroidism. That's why that's on there. Yeah.
So how do you avoid those things, besides the fluoride's kind of obvious?
Fluoride's obvious. The bromides in bread. A lot of bromides in
Brominated, whatever.
Mountain Dew has a lot of soft drinks have bromide. The nice thing is if you flood your system with iodine, and I don't recommend doing this, but if you do, you're going to push out a lot of this bromide, and you get this what they call a bromide cough, and it's actually like this brown, rusty, mucusy sputum. I've never experienced that, and I've taken a ton of iodine. So there's different ways to approach that iodine safely. Bottom line, get your iodine level tested first, and then we'll talk about dosing, because that's a slippery slope we've got to be careful with. So stress. So with stress, I mentioned this already, but it can create a sluggish thyroid production for, I didn't know this, 6 to 18 months out. So even though you're through that stressful situation, you've had this huge bump in your cortisol, and now it's back to normal, you could have lingering effects for, you know, up to a year and a half. Great, right? Good news there, sorry about that.
Does that help stress?
Yeah, humor, yeah. So glandular supplementation in this situation might be beneficial. To administer for 1 to 2 months, withdraw, recheck lab. So we sell a lot of glandular products here, especially with standard process. And they do help in the short term, for sure. I've seen patients come in and they feel great, and they're like, oh my God, it's the best thing ever. And then 3 to 6 months down the road, yeah, they slip back again. Like, wow, I was working at first, what's going on? There's a lot of mechanisms that could be going on, but it's not, again, this is just a short-term fix to make you feel better, but it's not a long-term solution. So we've got to be careful with glandulars. There's the desiccated adrenal by standard. Again, it is a great product. It does help in the short term. But again, we want to get our thyroid gland working on its own as efficiently as we can. I mentioned this already, but just to reiterate again, excessive thyroid medication, again, that's vague there, but it can also suppress TSH. So you keep giving that patient a higher and higher dose because they keep complaining of more and more symptoms of low thyroid. We got to be careful with that situation. Gland destruction. This a little bit more.
It's way more depressing than I thought it was gonna be.
There's hope. We'll get to that.
First he scares you.
Yeah.
Right.
First I scare you, yeah. If you've got gland destruction, if you've got autoimmune disease, you've got antibodies in your system, definitely start looking at heavy metals as well. Don't just think it's just an autoimmune and there's not heavy metals. There's a high likelihood that you've got lead, mercury, XYZ heavy metal in excess in your body. We got to look at that and treat that appropriately. That's the issue.
How is that tested?
You could do a urine test. We have those here. Again, I would just go back to the doctor though, as the first starting point. Hey, can you do a urine test for heavy metals? Or at least let's start there, and then again rule it out.
So will a regular doctor test for that, if you ask?
That's
Most likely
probably
not.
Yeah, no testing. I mean, a lot of what I'm going through right now is it's functional medicine doctors. Yeah,
Will insurance cover that kind of stuff?
probably not. Yeah. I mentioned this already about the liver insufficiency. So if we have a congested liver, if we just have liver damage in general, we got to start looking at how are we going to improve T4 T3 conversion. So we'll, again, in a little bit here, we'll go through the handout, and you'll see, it'll be very clear if you're not converting T4 to T3, even though all of your labs look fine. Right, you're gonna have this aha moment, just like I did, going, oh my gosh, I gotta help my liver out here, I gotta help with conversion.
What would be the cause of a liver insufficiency? Most people, I mean, other than maybe alcoholism.
Yeah, alcohol is a good culprit.
Street drugs.
Yeah, anything that's, a lot of medication, everything
Yes,
metabolized by the
medicine.
liver. Yeah, Tylenol toxicity, those types of things. Hepatitis or history of, previous
Yeah,
infections.
those are extreme.
Those are extremes, yeah.
What about fatty liver?
Fatty liver, yeah, I wouldn't think all alcohol is gonna be your. And there's things like milk thistle, artichoke, I won't get into all of it tonight, detox cleanses, things that help with phase 1, phase 2 liver detox. There's things, it's a product called N-acetylcysteine that is, we'll talk about that a little bit later, that helps improve liver function, which then improves T4 to T3 conversion.
Would you have to have yourself tested, have all the thyroid numbers tested? Couldn't you, especially if they're relatively normal, you could kind of just go.
Certainly could, yeah. I would still like to have at least some baseline level. I'd like to have the T3 and the T4 in both total and free fraction, just to kind of have that in my mind.
Yeah.
But then start to treat empirically. I can't use the word treat, but
Right.
recommend. So with production, like gut, food, infection. So typical antibody production stems from gut integrity breakdown. So what do I mean by that? Is there's some offending agent that's actually getting through the gut lining, which essentially looks very similar to the cells of our thyroid gland, and the body just can't tell it apart. So it goes, well, this is similar enough to my thyroid tissue, but what is it doing in my gut? I better get rid of it. So I'm going to produce an antibody to clean it out. And so really got to look, when we start looking at production decreases due to the gut integrity issues, I'm starting to look at things like gluten, and I'm starting to think, okay, what do I need to do to reestablish that gut barrier so that I can then calm my immune system down? Talked about food sensitivity, so if you haven't had a food sensitivity test, and again, you've kind of gone through the previous lists, not a bad idea to start looking at gluten allergies or dairy, soy. Finally get that food allergy test done. See what you're sensitive to. It's not like a anaphylactic allergy where your lips swell and you can't breathe kind of a thing, but it's a sensitivity issue. So is it causing inflammation and a disruption in your immune system? If it is, we should stay away from it. Most patients are going to have a gluten sensitivity if they already have a thyroid issue going on. Chronic infection, I already touched on the Epstein-Barr virus, but H. pylori could set off low production, SIBO, Lyme, Candida. So these could be the underlying issues of your thyroid toxicity and hormone. So if you never even look at these, we could just be feeding that patient thyroid hormone year after year, managing their labs and never get into that. They're still having symptoms, but their labs look fine. And they could have an H. pylori infection. That's H. pylori is it's a bacteria in the GI tract, in the stomach essentially. It causes a lot of heartburn issues, acid reflux issues.
And what's
50% SIBO is when there's basically bacterial growth from the colon into the small intestine. So there's different bugs for different regions of the GI tract.
Okay,
And so they small intestine, yeah, bacteria. So you get the wrong bugs in the wrong area. So let's say we've looked at, gut food infections. I'm going to go backwards here. We looked at toxicity issues. Like all of these things are a non-issue. And we've kind of crossed out all those lists, checked all those boxes. Everything's fine. And then we get to this point. So T4 is optimal. Dan, I have a perfect TSH. But T4 is fine. Even my free fraction T4 is okay. still symptomatic. What, you know, really getting frustrated at this point. Talked about the excessive binding, so again, look at those oral estrogens. Are you on an oral estrogen? Do you need to be on the oral estrogen? Look at your chronic insomnia. Are you sleeping well? Improper metabolism of thyroid replacement medication. So, you know, what am I getting at there? So if you keep flooding your system with more and more thyroid hormone, you're going to start cranking up binding protein. And then you're going to take away all the players to not have that, again, that net effect at the end of the day. So again, what does T3 do? Activates. Got to make sure we get down the wind near the end of the game. We need more free T3. But you can see already there's a lot of things that are setting us up for failure here. The other thing that's important to know, this test isn't offered very often. The lab that I use, I'll get to in a minute, ZRT, they don't offer a reverse T3 lab. I'm not sure why that is, if they just can't measure it. I've seen many patients bring in, comparatively, it's been a small number, but all things considered, there's patients that bring in the reverse T3 number, and that's important to know, because you start getting down the list of all of these labs that I want you to do, and if you have too much reverse T3, guess what happens? Guess where a reverse T3 sits? It's on the receptor, on your gene, in your nucleus, in your cell, that's blocking your T3 from doing what it needs to do. And that could be because of your thyroid hormone. Your thyroid hormone could be making you sick. Plain and simple. Less is more, essentially, right?
And when you say thyroid supplement, you mean the prescription?
That's, yeah, thyroid medication, yeah. For conversion, so let's talk about, we alluded to this earlier, this enzyme. Not that the name is important, but it's basically taking, again, you got T4, you got 4 iodine molecules on your thyroid hormone. You got to peel one of them off through this enzyme to get to T3. The problem is that enzyme is really fussy. There's a whole list of nutritional deficiencies that will make that enzyme not happy. So selenium, zinc, chromium, here's iodine again. Making sure we have, I listed these 4 up here, these are more important to look at. So making sure you have enough selenium, at least 200 micrograms a day. Making sure you have enough zinc, ranges from anywhere from 10 to 50 milligrams a day. Chromium, looking at that, and again, iodine. Less important, but still, you should include on the list, vitamin A, B2, B6, B12, vitamin E, iron and copper. I'll get back to iron in a minute. That's an important one, I probably should have put it on top. What else? Medication. So here's a big one. Beta blockers. I see that all the time. People with anxiety, they'll have doctors will put patients on metoprolol, atenolol. Anyone with high blood pressure might be put on a beta blocker, and the consequence of that is now they start getting a sluggish thyroid because now they can't convert 4 to 3. Talked about SSRIs already. So there's a double whammy. If you're on an SSRI, you're on Prozac, you're dumping all these halides into your system, pushing out your iodine, and you're blocking the enzyme for conversion. Opiates, pain medications, antibiotics. We talked about progesterone just a little while ago, so low progesterone. So having the proper amount of progesterone is critical. I should have put low or high. So if you have not enough progesterone, that enzyme isn't very happy, but if you have excess, that doesn't make it happy either. So you gotta have that balance there with the progesterone for sure. Chemotherapy is on there. Lifestyle, environmental. So aging, alcohol, obesity, cigarette smoking, chronic inflammation or chronic infection. Like I said, even we talked about Epstein-Barr, even if it's dormant, still look at that. Kidney disease, liver disease. There's a lot of factors that affect this little enzyme. It's too bad it's so sensitive, but that's the way it is. But these are all possible things we could be looking at. So everything that we just talked about up until now, I call it functional hypothyroidism. There's a reason why the thyroid gland isn't producing enough thyroid hormone. And so what do we want to do? We want to reduce stress, because cortisol has a direct impact on that enzyme and that conversion. So we got to get cortisol down to a normal level. If you're on prednisone or some kind of steroid, work with your doctor on getting off of that. That would be important. Replace nutritional factors affecting the enzyme. We just touched on that already. I put on here, take thyroid. So there's a lot that I just uncovered there. I know it's just getting really depressing at this point, but if you don't have Hashimoto's, everything that I pretty much covered up into this point is wrapped up into this one product. So that's pretty nice. So it's got vitamin A, it's got C, it's got E, it's got iodine, it's got zinc, it's got N-acetylcysteine, it has L-tyrosine, it's got ashwagandha, guggul resins, and turmeric. So it covers a lot of bases. So that's, and there's, every vitamin company has a thyroid support product that basically has, all the minerals and nutrients to get that enzyme to be happy.
Why is it bad if you already have the Hashimoto's?
Yes, so the issue with Hashimoto's is if you give a patient iodine that has Hashimoto's, they're going to produce more thyroid hormone, but now the immune system doesn't like that because you're cranking out more hormone. Yeah, it's like putting gas on a fire.
So there's a system that will producing more antibodies to
Yes.
after the more.
Yeah, great, I know, right?
And
So
that's TPOs, is that?
TPOs, yeah, if your TPO level is elevated and then you give somebody iodine, their TPO is going up, in most cases.
Can I just stop a second?
Yep.
I've seen so many doctors about my thyroid for so long, and none of the conventional doctors ever told me if I have or do not have Hashimoto's. So I'm just wondering how many people even really know.
They don't, yeah. Most of the patients that I meet with here at this pharmacy, they don't have their TPO number. Yeah. So you have to test. If you have hypothyroidism, if you have low thyroid function, you need to know if you have antibodies or not. Yeah. And if you can't get the level tested, then come here and we'll test it for you. Yeah.
Isn't there a, school of thought or something that even if you have Hashimoto's, you should take iodine?
Yes, you've got to be very careful with the amount. So there's even arguments that if you even take like 100 micrograms, that could spur out of control, and make that patient worse.
Shannon, can't hear you, can you repeat yourself?
Well, there's the Hashimoto's and the iodine. So there's two schools of thought with iodine and Hashimoto's. One is take the iodine, and the other one is don't take the iodine. I say test the level first, and if you're deficient, then supplement. Thyroid peroxidase, and then enzyme, or antibodies.
So if you're over or under, it means
If you're, tell me your question again, if you're over,
yeah, the value for.
for the TPO, your TPO level should be below 40.
Okay.
You shouldn't have antibodies. Antibodies are, they kill the tissue, they damage the tissue of the thyroid gland, so we don't want antibodies.
Is that the same as like thyroid?
Yes.
The iodine test, is that the test where they give you 50 milligrams of iodine? Okay.
Yes.
I know,
That's like a double-edged sword, right? How do you?
Well, you can do a test now for iodine without taking the 50 milligrams of a loading dose. You can just literally clean a cup and test it. So there's better testing modalities now.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I know, I thought the same thing. Talked about that already. All right, so we got through all of that. What if my labs are still normal? Oh, that's exhausting, isn't it? So you can have something called functional hypometabolism. What the heck is that? Chronically high levels of cortisol. So again, this is a patient, all of their labs are normal. and you fill out the symptom survey and you score, you shouldn't score anything, right? It's like golf, you should have a low score, right? And you score 100. That's a problem. We would categorize you as functional hypometabolism. Do you have chronic low levels of cortisol, so high or low? Do you have low levels of vitamin D? I didn't talk about this before, but vitamin D is imperative to getting that enzyme converting 4 to 3. Circling back to iron, if you have low iron, that enzyme is not going to be happy. Talked about low progesterone, so here's excessive progesterone. So again, if all of your labs are good and hit one of these categories, you could still have.
What's considered low cortisol and what's considered?
I would strictly base it on the reference ranges from the lab. Yeah. I mean, I don't think. In order to have your thyroid produce a metabolic effect, the free T3 must be, the answer is, it's got to be absorbed into the cell. So if the T3 in your lab is fine, it still has to get transported into every cell in our body, which then has to then go to, which we talked about already, I got ahead of myself, to the nucleus. Then it's got to sit on the receptor, and the receptor has to be there, and the receptor has to be working. It's got to bind, and then it does its action. Then that T3 sits on the receptor and produces the effect that we want it to do. And then our thermostat kicks on, and it's ready to go. And then our symptoms go away. All that has to happen behind the scenes, but there's a lot that can go wrong. So you've got to get free T3, it's got to be absorbed, it's got to be transported, it's got to bind, and the receptor's got to be there. Again, so your labs could be, let's talk about normal versus optimal. So where I get the packet out, let me grab my packet. So this is a lot too, especially doctors will call me and say, oh, I got these labs and they don't make any sense. And I get that quite often. Timing is everything. So here's your medication, Synthroid. If you are on Synthroid, you want to do your blood test between, let's say, I'm going to make up a number here. You get up at 6 a.m. You take your thyroid medication at 6 a.m. Don't get your blood drawn until 10 o'clock, or up to 16 hours later.
See, why is it that they tell you, oh, it doesn't matter, just whenever, that's all good.
It does matter. So when you look, and this is basic pharmacology or pharmacokinetics 101. Anytime you take a medication, right, you're going to have a peak and a trough. I don't want to measure you at the peak, and I don't want to measure you at the bottom. I want to measure you right in the middle. That's most depictive of where the patient lives day after day after day after day. So, Cytomel, which is T3, 2 to 4 hours after you take your dose. That's when you want your blood drawn.
And how exact do those need to be?
If this was me, I would pick the middle. I'd go 8 hours.
Okay, how about for the
I'd go in
porcine?
for the porcine 4 hours. But I know there's not. There wasn't. I don't know why Jim didn't put a back end of that one.
So what happens, so for the porcine?
Yep.
If you take that and then you get your labs drawn, say 2 hours, is that gonna show a peak?
It's going to show them elevated.
Okay, so
Yep.
the 4 hours is.
We went right in the middle. Yeah, we went right at midpoint. Exactly. For
So
those
you
of
only take it once a day, and there's obviously more than 4 hours in a day, so does that mean after 4 hours you're falling off until the following morning?
yes and no. So let's talk about Synthroid. So Synthroid has a half-life in your body for about 3 days. Really long time. And so yeah, you're falling off obviously throughout the day, but if I look at it over day after day after day after day, you're going to get to a baseline, essentially. And so what you're metabolizing and losing, you're replacing on a daily basis. So.
And is that true for all the types? Like for Cytomel and the porcine too?
With Cytomel with T3, the half-life on Cytomel, I believe is, I don't have that number off the top of my head. I always remember 3.5 days for T4. I think Cytomel, it's short, it's like 12 hours, it's shorter. So that one is more sensitive, and that's why the midpoint is closer towards us.
Okay.
What if you take your medication at
Ah.
night?
Yeah, labs aren't open at 4 in the morning, are they?
Freighter
Or
does, I
three.
think.
Yeah.
I thought it was 24 hours.
I don't have a good answer for that one.
It
Yeah.
works really well for me at night.
Yeah, I know, and there are patients that take it at night, and that's fine. One of the myths out there is that your T3 and your T4 are gonna keep you up, right? Your metabolism hormone or pill, but you can take your thyroid at night, no problem, essentially. I mean, you might have don't quote me here, you might have a couple nights there at the beginning, but once you get into that steady state level, really your thyroid dose, what time of day doesn't really matter. For those of you that get the compounded T3, T4 here, that's a slow release product. The filler that we use in that particular capsule, that slowly breaks down over about an 8 to 12 hour period. So that particular patient, you're in that 4 to 8 hour window. Okay. I hit on most of these already for what you want for lab testing. So again, total T4, T3, your TSH, your TPO, your antibodies. Didn't talk a lot about vitamin D, but that helps that enzyme work. I always get the question of how much vitamin D should I take. My answer is enough to get your blood level between 50 to 90. I think it's nanograms per milliliter. Ferritin, so you're going back to iron. Your ferritin level should be, I believe it's above 80 or 90.
90 to 110.
90 to 110. A lot of labs have a ferritin level that the normal range is, I think, goes down to like 20 or 30. And again, you're normal, but I would argue if you're not.
So how much should it be, about 100?
Yeah, 90 to 110.
Are you not concerned with iron interfering then with ferritin? I've been told to be careful of iron.
Because of what interference?
I don't know,
Oh.
they said it would interfere,
It
so.
wouldn't interfere?
Yeah, so just ignore that?
Oh, I get what you're saying. No, don't ignore that. So don't take your iron with your thyroid medication. Take your iron, give me at least 4 hours between your thyroid in the morning and your iron at night or at lunch. Yeah, that's a good question. The other things that interact with thyroid medication, since we're on that topic, is calcium. So mainly minerals will bind with thyroid hormone. They will literally combine and you'll never absorb them. So there's a huge waste of money there. So don't take your minerals. You need them. Take them at least 4 hours after the thyroid dose. We talked about cortisol enough, so I'm not going to hit on that. Basal body temperature. I think I put the guide in there on how to accomplish that in the handout. Here's another thing. I should have put this on the slide previous, but when you are, chasing into the lab and you're running late and and you're getting your blood drawn, you need to sit there for 15 minutes. Read a book, do something calm and relaxing. Even just running into the lab because you're late for work and you got to get your blood drawn or whatever that is, that burst of cortisol is going to screw up your lab values.
Wow.
So you want to be consistent on how you get your blood drawn every single time, for sure. Use the same lab, use the same phlebotomist if you can. Everything should be the same. Just eliminate that. There's enough complication here, right? We've gone through that, beat that up enough. At least get the labs consistent. Just use the same lab, do it the same way, same time after your last dose, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's critically important. Then we're looking at the same stuff.
Is that true of blood work in general then, not just for thyroid?
I know it is for thyroid. I'm
Not sure.
not sure.
What's the forecast cortisol?
So a lot of times you'll just get a cortisol test in the morning, measure your stress hormone.
Yeah.
But I want to know what it is at noon,
Oh,
at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then right before you go to bed. So we have a saliva test kit here that measures cortisol, and I call it the 4-point,
okay.
which is just 4 different samples of cortisol. I'm going to circle back. We talked a little bit about this. I'm going to circle back on this a little bit. Again, Hashimoto's. So a third of the patients with hypothyroidism in general have Hashimoto's. So it's really not an endocrine disorder. even though, again, that's the end result, it's an autoimmune disease. So we need to change our whole perspective on how we go about fixing this problem. The tests, I mentioned this already, but so thyroid peroxidase antibodies, that's your TPO number. You can also develop antibodies for the thyroid globulin protein. They can actually attack the protein, and you still need that protein binding, but you can have antibodies developed to that protein, and that's a problem. I mentioned this already, but it could take up to 10 years for these, for the TSH to actually show up on a traditional test, and you've got this autoimmune disease just building in the background before your doctor ever realizes it, if they're just testing your TSH. I think I could spend 2 hours talking about Hashimoto's, but really, at the end of the day, you want to take out the antigen. So your body is producing all of these antibodies, and I want to take a mop and suck all those up, or a vacuum cleaner, and just get rid of all these antibodies that are attacking your thyroid gland. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I'm most comfortable with immune globulin G. So immune globulin therapy, actually it's sold, here's a canister of immune globulin G right here. You can get it as IV. I mean, there's a lot of immune globulin products out there. This is one that we just happen to particularly sell. It's called SBI. It's a serum-derived immune globulin, but that basically goes around and sequesters or sucks up all this antibody and gets rid of it. It's expensive, it's a long process, but if you have Hashimoto's, you probably want to do this.
How long would it take roughly when you felt better?
Yeah, that's slow and steady. 3 months, 6 months, it's a process, for sure.
Is there a quick way to define or describe Hashimoto's?
It's just your immune system that's gotten bad information and it's attacking the wrong tissue. Instead of attacking a virus, it's attacking your own cells in your thyroid gland. Yeah. It's just, so we want to stop this immune activation is essentially what we want to do with Hashimoto's.
Dan, do you do the 2 scoops at once, or 1 scoop twice a day?
I've been told to do it 1 scoop twice a day, to spread it out.
Okay,
Yeah.
and this is the one?
That's the same stuff. Yeah. The other thing with Hashimoto's is there's a lot of cellular inflammation going on. There's a lot of gut permeability. I'm a big fan of this Inflammacore, which is basically I call it 7 products in 1. It's got everything from turmeric to glutamine, everything that helps seal up the gut, the leaky gut syndrome effect. There's a key switch in our body called NF-kappa B. It's basically, once that switch gets turned on, the inflammation cascade just spreads out tremendously. Things like turmeric, skullcap help turn that switch back off, which is nice.
Is the Inflammacore better than the Glutashield?
In the case of Hashimoto's, absolutely. If I would, because there's glutamine in the Inflammacore as well as the Glutashield. Yeah, I know,
Maybe
yeah.
I should switch, instead of taking the Glutashield.
Wait. What's the one thing we gotta remember?
Reactivate.
What does TSH do?
That's
Not a damn thing. Fabricates. Yes. Yeah.